that's me rehearsing arguments that actually never happened, but I couldn't let go of them because I'm like, oh, I should have said that. And also I played too much Street Fighter when I was a kid. Please tell me you know what Street Fighter is so I don't feel so old. Okay, good. Okay, good. All right. So today, clearly, we're going to be talking about anger. Just a quick recap. All the way up to this video, we've talked about how emotions work, what ETCs are, what ECs are, trauma simplified, how things are rooted in the ETC of fear, ETC of grief, and today we're going to talk about the ETC of anger. Anger is actually considered more of a secondary emotion because it's rooted in grief mostly and actually fear as well too, and that's what we're going to learn today. Anger is pretty straightforward, just like fear and grief, as an emotion that causes suffering, an emotion that we can actually feel physiologically. It's a little bit more like fear in the sense that it gives you a lot of energy. It's an active force, rather than grief, which is very heavy, passive, and depleting in nature. And one of the ways that you can see it related to fear is that it could be considered a survival response. The fight or flight famous saying that we have. When we have some type of a perceived threat and we're scared, we tend to either run away from it or we try to fight it off head on. So that's one way to recognize it as part of the emotional pain of fear. And also grief that is unresolved and hasn't been addressed and festers and grows will turn into anger and rage. Okay. Now, some of the areas in the psychological world where anger is very common and prevalent is in the cluster B personality disorders. And 3 of those personality disorders that are very well known now are borderline personality, narcissistic personality disorder, and antisocial / sociopathic or sociopathy personality disorder. Sociopathy is basically having some type of core detachment with another human being, is a way to kind of objectify humans. So it's very easy to pour out rage and cruelty because there's no connection whatsoever there. It's serial killers are sociopathic in nature. There is some literature out there that talks about really high performing CEOs have that nature as well too, where there's just a level of detachment. Narcissistic personality disorder, someone who does abuse, either physically, psychologically, violates sexually, violates boundaries. And there are a lot of subcategories of that, which I'm not going to get into. But for the sake of this video, it's just understanding what the core wounding in someone with narcissistic personality disorder is. It's shame. And as we've talked about in the previous video, shame is full on rooted in grief. So the core wounding of someone with narcissistic personality disorder is grief, and that grief is so deep and it's so covered up with so many different coping mechanisms and defense mechanisms that it pours out onto others through anger and abusive behavior. And then there's borderline personality disorder, where a core wounding with someone that has borderline is a fear of abandonment. And the word fear even pops up there, right? And so borderline could be considered rooted more in fear. There's a lot of trust issues. It's a lot of hot and cold, kind of coquettish behavior, push-pull behavior in that sense. And a lot of it kind of mimics and overlaps bipolar disorder. The big difference is bipolar disorder is considered an issue with brain chemistry. So it's treated with lithium and or Depakote. They can actually check Depakote levels with someone who has bipolar disorder to see if it's an organic brain issue versus someone who is borderline can be set off by certain relational things. But a lot of the symptomology overlap and look the same. And with borderline, like I said, it's rooted in fear, fear of abandonment, trust issues, and as I've talked about in a previous video, the one around fear, when we don't have trust, that is rooted in fear. So it's all kind of aligning with the concepts that we're learning through this series. Now, of course, as someone who has borderline personality disorder does have intermittent moments of anger and rage that comes out. Now, that is also a segue to bipolar disorder. Anytime I have a client come to me and they've been diagnosed with bipolar disorder, the first thing I hear is trauma. Bipolar disorder, has actually all of it together: fear, anger, and grief. So it just kind of vacillates between going through a fearful spell, going through a depressive episode, going through angry outbursts. And another one that is not as recognized through the lens that I'm working through and I'm teaching you, which is ADHD. And you may have heard me mention that in previous episodes. ADHD, I have a very conservative approach to that diagnosis because it is under the umbrella of neurodivergence, which implies that there is some kind of brain deficit or brain dysfunction. And when I used to work in a children's clinic, and they would diagnose children with ADHD left and right, and they would say it's because, the prefrontal cortex isn't developed correctly. I'm like, well, yeah, they're a kid. The brain's still developing. So I've always taken more of a conservative approach, and I found that most children that were diagnosed with ADHD were actually presenting with fear or anxiety, childhood anxiety or childhood depression in that sense. So, however, just a side note, I have noticed people who are gamers and have been gamers from a very young age, their brains are processing and developing a bit differently. So I do believe that ADHD as a neurodivergent disorder is more prevalent with brains that have been developed with heavy gaming. Again, different topic. We're still talking about anger. Now, how is ADHD related to anger? I invite you to see ADHD through a couple of different points of the diagnosis, where it talks about difficulty with concentration and easy distractibility. However, if it's something that the person is really passionate about, they can be hyper focused for long periods of time. That in itself is kind of discounting the issue to begin with, right? If there's an issue with concentration, then if it's something that you're really interested in and you can be focused for long periods of time, that doesn't imply a brain issue or brain disorder. That's more along the lines of, I don't want to do this one thing, but when I do want to do something, I'm all in with it. So that's more of a boundary violation. And boundary violations are rooted in fear. Again, it could be a threat or a trauma response. And it could be something as benign as, I have to go to school, but for whatever reason, I'm not ready for it. Or I'm having processing issues with the curriculum. Or I'm scared of the bully in school today, and I'm just uncomfortable with going to school. So there's a high level of distractibility because being forced to be put in a position to do something that you don't want to do for a prolonged period of time, you're going to try to find a way to cope with it. So if you can't physically move your body out of the situation, you're going to mentally find a way to distract and check yourself out. And that is also giving a message of like, well, too bad you have to do this thing because everybody does it. Again, I'm not saying that it's necessarily a traumatic experience that's happened there, but it's just understanding what I mean by boundary violations. And also, I've noticed children that were often diagnosed with ADHD, they are known to have really poor social skills or poor social boundaries, and when I work with the children and the families, well, it seemed like that boundary violations were a part of the family dynamics and the family system. And so it's more of a boundary violation rather than a neurological disorder in most cases, but not in all cases. And then also there is some anger involved with ADHD. So if boundaries are violated enough and we're not being heard enough, and we're not being seen enough, and people aren't listening to our boundaries, at some point we're going to get upset, we're going to get angry, and we're going to push back somehow. So that's just those are just a few psychological diagnoses. Now let's talk about more day in, day out concepts like jealousy and betrayal. Jealousy is strongly an angry reaction, and that's full on rooted in grief. Jealousy happens because, let's say, it often happens in the case of relationships where, let's say, your partner is looking at someone else or talking to someone else. Relationship jealousy. Well, that's more rooted in grief because the core pain underneath that is, I'm not enough, I'm not good enough, you don't love me, I'm not the one. So it hurts, it causes pain, it causes sadness. And a way to digest or move through that sadness is to maybe have it come out as jealousy and lash out through jealousy, because the pain is so heavy, it needs to come out in that sense. As well as betrayal. Betrayal is rooted in the same type of pain of, you chose someone else over me, or you betrayed my trust. So again, going into grief and fear, because as I mentioned earlier, fear is rooted, trust issues are rooted in fear. And of course, feeling like I'm not enough, or I'm not the only one, or you don't care about me, is rooted in grief. So betrayal has both of those components. And then there are more low-grade forms of anger in terms of being annoyed or being irritated or being frustrated. And that's often found in this tech world that we're working with, when technology doesn't work with us often, like the Zoom meeting glitches, the Wi-Fi doesn't work, or in times when we are not face-to-face with another person, like when we get annoyed when someone cuts us off, or depending on how much fear and grief we're carrying inside of us when someone cuts us off, we might get really scared, and it might make us angry and have road rage, or we might feel like less than, or not important, or not significant enough, and it may come across as road rage and anger to go out of our way to maybe get back at somebody in that sense, to be like, hey, look at me, see me, I'm important. Why did you discount me or bypass me? So those are just a few ways to see the painful role of anger, and how it's actually a secondary emotion, how it's mostly rooted in grief, and can often also be rooted in fear. Now, in our next video, we're going to start talking about the difference, how to be able to understand the difference between a symptom, when your body's trying to tell you, hey, I'm not doing well, one of my ETCs is activated, versus what it means to cope with those ETCs, versus and what those coping mechanisms or defense mechanisms are, and then other ways to start looking at how to deal with it. And that's where I'm going to start introducing a little bit of a different approach to deal with your ETCs. All right. Well, thank you very much for being here with me today. May peace be with you, and I'll see you next time.